It's LEED Platinum certified, the first apartment building in the United States powered and heated with a fuel cell. This building here is my own house in Westport, which in some respects is where I learned the most about electrification, because I bought a historic house that had an oil furnace and a hot water heater and was very leaky. And over the course of about 6 years, I air sealed it, and I replaced the furnace with a heat pump, and I put an air source hot water heater in, and I put 64 panels on, so I have basically a net zero house with a historic retrofit. And then this building is the Bank of America Tower in Hartford, which we redeveloped into apartments. It's a LEED Platinum certified building with a fuel cell and solar on the roof. But I'm going to first talk about the Cary, which you guys just saw up close, and our sort of assignment, which we broadened. Originally, Josh wanted to recover from a fire and make the space more attractive, but we did some research about Malcolm Wells and realized that this really is a building that should symbolize the mission of the Cary. And so we wanted to look at every aspect of that. Because this is, for only 10 years, it reflected its values, but the solar panels failed quickly, the geothermal failed, and then for most of its life, it had a second roof that was built to keep it from leaking. It had conventional fossil fuel systems, but then the second roof failed, and so we tried to research and bring back what was the values of the building to what you see today and what you just toured through. But I want to take a moment to talk about Malcolm Wells. He, in many ways, was the founder of the green building movement in the United States. He was writing in Progressive Architecture in 1964 about how architects have failed humanity by ignoring the environmental consequences of their building. He was a big proponent of underground construction because back then we didn't know what passive house was. We didn't have the building science developed to realize that you could actually insulate a building just as well with good air sealing and good quality materials. But his own home, which was called Solaria, was half buried. He wrote a book called Passive Solar Energy in the 60s, and he died in 2009, but I think what we're all doing today, we owe him credit for getting it started. If not getting us upset enough that we could address these problems with the energy they deserve. So here's his original cross-section. He wanted it to be a paradigm for ecological rationality, but it ended up being sort of an experiment that sort of failed, but it was a compelling idea. Here you see some aerials of the sawtooth structure buried in the soil. And this was the plan. There was an addition to the west of it, but it's a simple C-shaped building with a lower level that was completely underground. And here's the cross-section showing the collar ties that were removed. And I think this is from Progressive Architecture showing some of the interiors, which were pretty pleasant when it worked and there was a natural light coming through. But after, this is a picture I took when I first came up here, and you can see the standing seam roof that was put on top that then leaked. And this is what the interiors looked like. They were pretty claustrophobic and cluttered and not that inspiring. And here I am with two of the architects on our staff and Josh back in, this is probably 2019, in that interstitial space between the original roof and the added roof. And so that was a concept rendering to return it to its original idea. Here it is sitting in the landscape. This is the plan as it existed in 2019, and we just added a few hundred square feet to create a courtyard and also to continue the circulation around and open the plan up to the landscape with views in each direction. and this is just the concept of bringing the light in from above. I think the single most important thing we did for a sustainability perspective was reuse the building, because they were thinking about bulldozing it and starting over. And here you can see across the highway is the solar field, which actually produces twice as much energy as the building uses. So it, I guess over time it will actually compensate for the upfront carbon that was involved in the renovation, but maybe even in the original construction. There really wasn't any concrete. Most of the materials we used were wood and natural bio-based materials, other than maybe the EPDM roof and even the copper, I think, is a natural material. Okay, so that brings us to the other project that we sort of did simultaneously with the Cary. Both of these projects were started in 2019 and finished in 2022. This is the original Armstrong Rubber Company building, designed by Marcel Breuer he designed it in 1968. And it is a real landmark of brutalist architecture. It certainly has a lot of embodied carbon in the concrete. It's a massive concrete block building, but very expressionist. The concrete is quite artfully sculpted. And here we are at Hotel Marcel, which is, it's right in New Haven as you come into the city in the Long Wharf area. So I've actually been developing this decarb toolkit, because it turns out, this is the first hotel I was involved in. It turns out I'm the architect, owner, and developer. I couldn't find a client to do this, so I had to figure out how to do it myself. But after doing it, I thought, here, I'm a newcomer to the hotel industry. The big major brands and hotel owners would have figured out how to build hotels to deal with the climate crisis, given how much hotels talk about their sustainability commitments. But it turns out that this is the only all-electric hotel, the only passive house certified hotel in the United States. It's the largest passive house certified hotel in the world. In fact, I was asked to present this in Austria at the PHI conference in April. But so I've developed there's sort of 4 categories of things that we can do, and these really apply to commercial buildings, or almost any buildings, but they're easily replicated for hotels, which is to basically switch all the fuels to electricity to get rid of CO2 emissions, and that can be done, with every component of equipment, from the emergency generator by using batteries to the domestic hot water system and heating and cooling, and even the vans can be electric, which we have demonstrated. Then there are basically 5 categories of things that we do to save energy. Passive house is the primary thing that actually can reduce energy demands by up to 80%. It makes it much easier to make all the energy on site. And we use energy recovery ventilation, which is a component of passive house. We even have an all DC electric system using Ethernet to power and control the lights, which is cheaper to install. A lot of these things are cost savings, not extras. A lot of elevators are regenerative, which we have, and then we do a good job with monitoring and controlling our energy systems. And then we do things that actually fund all the incremental costs. This actually required less equity and financing to do than a conventional hotel, because we were able to generate more money by producing our own electricity. We also get incentives from the utilities for peak shaving, and then we get up to 50% tax credits from the IRA to help pay for our microgrid, and we have other types of financing, such as CPACE. So here's the building as it appeared in 1972, with this amazing addition to the back, which housed the research wing, but that was taken down when IKEA bought the site in 2002. But it's just this heroic, monumental piece of sculpture that was empty for 20 years. And here's some photographs that we found at the Smithsonian Archive of the interiors, the executive offices, which are now hotel rooms you can stay in, the entry lobby here. But when we acquired the building, it had been gutted because there was asbestos on all the steel. So we had sort of a free hand in planning the building. And the program is for 165 rooms. Apologize for this jumping ahead. In order to fund it, we use historic tax credits. Actually, this is the first historic tax credit project in the history of that program, which has been around since the 70s, to have triple glazed windows approved. I think we've demonstrated that an older building, even a historic building, can be just as energy efficient as a new building. And we had to meet the hotel brand standards, which was important to our financing. But then we have these goals for sustainability, which was to be LEED Platinum certified. That is, as you know, sort of a checklist of things. Oddly, there are actually only 10 other hotels that have done that out of the 20,000 in the United States. Passive house, which we've talked about. No fossil fuels, all electric. And we actually have just recently found a path to be at net zero by enrolling the balance of power and community solar from a nearby location. You guys know about LEED. It's really just a matter of collecting points for different categories, and we got over 80, which gave us the platinum certification. And here are some of the common areas. It's actually a conference hotel with over 9,000 square feet. So we actually have had some really interesting energy conferences. The AIA Connecticut had their their annual conference there as well. And it's every day there's another important issue being discussed there. But here's the typical hotel room. Breuer, we tried to look at Breuer's Bauhaus history and coming up with a way of replanning the building. And the building really was designed with a module, a 5-foot module. Every window, every panel was on a 5-foot module that aligned with the doors, light fixtures. So we have 10-foot standard guest rooms and 15-foot wide deluxe rooms. And then we also have some 14 rooms in the core. And here's some of the guest rooms, which the one up here is one of the original executive offices. We even have some light well units as well on the inside. And here's some of the meeting spaces. So the fuel switching, this is just a matter of picking different stuff. It's no harder than getting an electric car over a gas car. But we just went into this thinking we're not going to buy anything that uses fossil fuels. I think it actually saved us money because we didn't have to put in a gas line. So we got, Mitsubishi now has a commercial scale air source heat pump hot water heater, which works beautifully. It costs less to operate than a fossil fuel based one. We have Mitsubishi VRF pumps in every room and for the common areas. We have an all electric kitchen, which people are, but actually the chef loves it, and we've got a fantastic menu. We serve breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and it's quite popular. One thing that's quite an innovation is we have an all-electric laundry, and we actually got the first heat pump dryers from Electrolux. They were selling them in Europe, and we persuaded them to sell them to us, and now it actually has made a dramatic reduction in our energy costs. And we have a microgrid and an electric shuttle. So here's the Mitsubishi heat pump system for hot water. It doesn't really take up any more room than a regular hot water plant. Our electric kitchen. And I should mention on the electric kitchen, we can use a recirc hood, so we actually spend less energy heating and cooling the kitchen, and it's a much more pleasant place to work than one that constantly has fossil fuels burning. We all know how unhealthy it is to have natural gas. Even the pilot lights can elevate the risk of respiratory disease for families by 20%. So it's helpful. And here's our laundry with the heat pump dryers, which don't need outdoor venting. We did something interesting is that it was getting hot, so we put in a air source hot water in the corner of the room, which makes the hot water for the laundry but cools the room at the same time. And we even make our own cleaning chemicals rather than buying all these plastic chemicals. But we have 24 EV chargers, including 12 Tesla chargers and 12 level 2 chargers for overnight guests, and an electric van. And of course, bicycles are even better than that. I've started to look at the data in terms of how Hotel Marcel compares to other types of buildings and other hotels. And of course, hotels are the most carbon intensive buildings for operations, and we have zero carbon pollution. So it's not that hard to do. You can see how the typical carbon footprint is allocated between different types of energy demands. The heating and cooling is the primary one, but water heating is second to that. But these are very carbon intensive buildings. A lot of commercial buildings are, but they don't need to be. They don't need to generate any carbon. So we've put meters on different, we have like 40 sub-meters, so we're tracking this and monitoring where we can improve. And as you know, in New York City, they're tracking all these, there's a reporting requirement now, so we know how we compare to other types of buildings and other hotels. They're starting to find buildings that are in the worst third of carbon emissions. So I think everyone's going to be asking for strategies to reduce carbon emissions. And I have a theory that the architecture profession is going to be held liable if suddenly someone gets a fine of $500,000 because they designed a hotel that was based on fossil fuels. They're going to look to the people that design the systems. So I think there's going to be a mandate for us to quickly pivot towards zero emission buildings and ones that don't use that much energy. And even the hotel industry has, with their ESG reports, they have pledged to reduce their CO2 emissions. The interesting thing is they actually are not doing this. They are actually increasing the intensity of carbon emissions and energy use. And I think there's going to be a reckoning by 2030, which is when all their investors are going to have expected them to do this. And I don't know what's going to happen, but it's going in the opposite direction. And then, when we talk about tons of carbon emissions, it's hard to visualize the difference this makes. But if the Hotel Marcel was developed as a conventional hotel, looking at these benchmarks for other hotels, the hotel would create 750 metric tons of carbon pollution every year. So what does that mean? The EPA has a website you can go in and calculate what that equates to. But what's most striking to me is that if we had built a regular hotel or even renovated the hotel and put in fossil fuel equipment and didn't design to passive house requirements, it would take 846 acres of mature forest just to compensate for the emissions from one hotel, which is more than a square mile. So when someone comes to your community and says, I'm going to build a hotel, it's going to be powered with fossil fuels, what they're really saying is, I'm going to clear cut a square mile of forest. Who would let them do that? So here are some of the things that we do. We talked about passive house, which is, I think is the single most important thing. And I encourage you to talk to Ken if you don't already know about PHI. And I'm honored to be on his board to help spread the word about that, because it's such a simple system. Unlike LEED, which has like 80 things to track, there's only 5 things you need to do. And we're always finding ways to do it better. And And it turns out, I think the state of Massachusetts looked at it, and it's less than a 2% cost differential to meet those standards. You know, when you're air sealing a building, it's really more just better supervision, putting some tape on every once in a while where you might otherwise leave a gaping hole. So it's a very easy way to reduce your emissions and energy needs. Here's the cross section of the building. The other thing that I think we talked about is having a clearly defined passive house envelope for the air sealing and thermal insulation. The windows are also really key. I mean, we had the advantage of Breuer's deep set windows, so that these windows are in shade whenever it's in the summer, and they bring light in the winter. We had we worked with SWA, Stephen Winters Associates, to come up with a program for insulating and air sealing the exterior and making sure we didn't have any thermal bridging. And we did an energy model. We had 4 different kinds of insulation. Here are the windows that are, actually they're made by Clar, and I think Nate is in the room here who had helped us with those. He's a window expert. We use the same windows here at the Cary at the same time. And they're 2.5 inches thick, really high performance. They're laminated. There are 2 layers of lamination, 3 layers of glass. There's argon. And one byproduct of having these really high performance windows is the guests say it's the quietest hotel room they've ever stayed in, even though we're 200 feet from the highway. So there's a sense that when you build an energy efficient building, it's not going to be as comfortable, but it's actually more comfortable and it's quieter. And with passive house, the air's fresher. You know, when all these fires were going on and we had smoke everywhere, this was sort of a refuge because all the air is filtered. And when we changed the filters and washed them out, you could see, but we weren't breathing because it's really very effective to eliminate that. We also have this Swagon Gold ERV, which magically, I think it's something like 85% efficient. You know, you have outdoor air at 37 degrees. It just passes through this heat recovery wheel and ends up at 54 degrees just by passing over that wheel, that the other side of which is the air that's being exhausted from the bathrooms and the hallways. We have Mitsubishi VRFs. One thing we just discovered, because we're monitoring things, is we had it set in auto mode, and it was bouncing back between heating and cooling. We just set it to cool only, and we dropped our energy use by about 20%. So it's really important to monitor energy use. With the power over Ethernet, we are able to use touch screens and buttons and give our guests a lot more control with presets than a conventional system would use, but also the lighting, which is all LED lighting, uses about 30% less energy. Because even if you have an LED light fixture, typically there's a transformer that transforms from AC to DC, and that creates a lot of heat and actually uses about 20 or 30% more energy than if you just have a DC system. And these are basically the switches for the power over Ethernet system. And the original, there were a total of 530 of these light fixtures, 1x4 droppers that we salvaged and retrofitted for the lights that are in the corridor. And this shows the EUI for the building compared to other hotels and even other all-electric buildings. Of course, not all electric buildings are passive house designed, so we were able to outperform that. So we continue to collect data and share that, but I think what we're finding is that I think we only spent about 5% more overall, but we're able to reduce our energy bill. A typical hotel uses $15 in energy costs per occupied room night, and we're under $4. So it's like $200,000 of savings that we can use to pay our mortgage, or pay our staff better, whatever. Oh. And then this is interesting. This shows how hotels are typically an outlier in terms of their EUI, but with these strategies, hotels can be the best performing in terms of energy use. The other thing is we make most of the power on site with solar canopies. I'm surprised so many hotels have surface parking lots, but how often do you see one with a solar canopy? And actually the guests prefer it because their cars stay cool in the summer, and that's where most of the power comes from. And then, this is our batteries, which we have instead of a generator. Typical commercial generator has a cycle for an hour every week. It's noisy, costs thousands of dollars to maintain. We just have these batteries, and we have a microgrid controller. We can look at it and see how the building is doing it on a given day, whether we're making more power than we're using. And we're making, with the community solar, we're now making all the solar that we need. And there are plenty of incentives to pay for this. Even nonprofits and governments can now access the tax credit for solar. And the overall project was about a $62 million project, but the items in green were additional funding that we were able to get as a result of these things that we put into the building. So it actually was less expensive as a result of those supplemental funding sources. And we even get additional revenue from operating the building from the microgrid that we have. It pays for itself pretty rapidly. Anyhow, so I think I'm done with this case study. Generally, the solution is electrify everything and then design to reduce your energy requirements with passive house and a better insulation and better use of electricity, and then ideally make the power on site, although that's the least important because the grids will all be all electric, all renewable pretty soon. So I don't know, we can take questions later on the panel or how we want to proceed.
Maybe take one or two from the audience right now.
Sure. Yes.
I'm just curious, having some familiarity with the construction methodology of Breuer at that period of time, steel frame and all the rest of it. Just wondering how much of a challenge it was to eliminate thermal bridging in a building like that.
Yeah, this is what. Yeah, no, there was a sense that these buildings could not be insulated well, but it's actually, we didn't rely on the concrete for anything more than like a rain screen. So we ended up, the team at Stephen Winters did a very careful analysis. They were worried about water migration into the concrete that could impact if it was trapped there. But it's 6,000 PSI concrete, and it turned out that with their modeling that wasn't a risk. So we were able to apply insulation just to the inside. Now the inside of the precast had a lot of ins and outs. And so we couldn't use a closed cell foam to get there. So we used a little closed cell, a little open cell foam, some cellulose, some aerogel tape. But the interesting thing is it was, every 5 feet was the same, so we came up with one solution, tested it. It passed its blower door test with flying colors because it didn't leak at all. And but we had that concrete backing to basically build our insulation air sealing on, and it wasn't a problem. If there was exposed concrete, like there's some brutalist buildings like Boston City Hall, which have concrete inside and outside, I think that would be a tougher one. But here we already had a wall that had been built out because Breuer had designed radiators under the sills and had already come in about 2 feet from the concrete, so we had plenty of wall cavity to insulate in.
Sure, I guess my question, there's a steel frame. That's a curtain wall, just a big heavy one, right?
Yep.
And it's supported either by traditional curve clips like you might do a stone facade, or some embedded plates or T's or whatever inside the precast element, just to then connect to the building. So those aren't isolated.
Yeah, there was thermal bridging, and one of the things we ended up doing is we had to fireproof the steel again after the asbestos was taken off, and we found that by adding like an additional couple inches of fireproofing, that there was that actually did enough of a job to isolate it thermally, so it didn't radiate into the space. Another question.
How do you guys deal with the HVAC systems for each individual room? Normally they have PTACs. In this case, if it's all electric, I imagine you have
Well, yeah, it's actually the Mitsubishi has this VRF system called the multi-city system, and so it has one outdoor condenser. I think can serve up to 10 or 12 indoor units, and there's a box. There's one line of refrigerant that goes to that box, and there's I think 4 on every floor, and then the box has refrigerant lines that run out to the individual heat pumps, which are in the ceiling. I think I had a picture of it way back here. Oh, did I pass it? Yeah, well, it was actually, it's in the ceiling of the entrance. I may have passed it here. Let me go back. It's outside the bathroom in the vestibule. Oh, here we go. Let me go back, right there. If you see here, that's basically the indoor unit. Now, you could put it under the window, but with passive house, the thermal envelope is so good, it doesn't really matter where you have the heat pump. It doesn't have to be below the window. It can be right here in the corner, and the advantage of that is it's super quiet. People, can't hear it because it's remote from the bed. And so we just have one of these heat pumps. You only need like one, it's like a 1-ton unit. That's one of the smaller ones that they make on the inside, or less than that, in fact. And then they're ganged together in the corridors, and then they're served by, we have outdoor units either on the first floor or up on the mezzanine up on the roof. I know we have some great speakers lined up, so I don't want to steal any time from them. With that, Dr. Sutton.
And I'll just add that JC changed my life because progressive architecture came to that conference and published my talk, which elicited hate mail and love letters, which is typically the way people react to me, and the way you may react to me. So thank you for the invitation and for the great challenge of applying my work on racial justice at a symposium that deals with buildings as a factor in climate change. The invitation came through a colleague and former classmate in the environmental psychology program at the City University, Jan Degenschein. Where are you, Jan? Okay, good. I have a friend in the room. We had been out of touch for many years until we reconnected a little over a year ago when I sponsored one of his former employees for fellowship in the AIA. In that first encounter, we briefly discussed Jan's campaign for political office in a zip code that had just been named 7th in the nation in desirability, and where he was determined to convince the majority of his prospective constituents that higher density housing would benefit them. Jan modestly proposed to start at a lower than present density and then offer bonuses to developers who achieved a higher density. As you might imagine, he lost the election, but I hasten to say by just 11 votes. When Jan emailed me this summer to be a speaker for AIA's WHV Committee on Sustainability, he neglected to mention that the event would be in the village of Millbrook in Dutchess County. In fact, I thought he said Milford, which is why that says Milford. So, and I didn't realize it was Millbrook until I got here, but it doesn't matter because neither Millbrook nor Mill Ford are accessible by public transportation. I only learned this fact about a month ago, when I also realized that Millbrook and Milford and Dutchess County are predominantly Caucasian. Not only would I have a really big problem getting here, since I do not drive, but I would likely be talking about race, not the topic of the symposium, in a room of mostly or totally white people. I was beginning to regret having promised my old classmate that I would do this engagement. Then I learned about the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies, a 2,000-acre research complex designed by an award-winning architecture firm. To my delight, I discovered a journal article on segregation by Dr. Stuart T.A. Pickett, a distinguished senior scientist at the Cary Institute's Urban Ecology Program. Since this was the very topic I would need to discuss at a symposium on climate justice, perhaps I would not be so far out in left field after all. In the article, Dr. Pickett and his colleagues point out that despite small declines in some cities, racial segregation in U.S. cities persist. They note that though less pervasive than racial segregation, economic segregation also exists. From my own research, I know that this form of segregation has risen since the 1970s as a result of mounting economic inequality, and that proportionally an increasing number of low-income families live in majority low-income neighborhoods, and that an increasing number of upper-income families live in majority upper-income neighborhoods. Dr. Pickett and his colleagues further document the profound consequences of racial and economic segregation, which affects individuals' access to myriad resources, as well as their exposure to environmental hazards and risk. Referring to the detrimental consequences for African Americans, Dr. Pickett and his colleagues describe how access to quality education and less available green space, that they have less access to quality education and less available green space than their white counterparts in a given city. They conclude their article by suggesting that racially segregated urban communities should work against the damaging social norms and economic investments, or lack thereof, that have maintained white supremacy and the continued subjugation of people of color. In other words, Dr. Pickett and his colleagues center their concern about segregation in cities where most people of color live, and see that population as the source of change. Unfortunately, neither Dr. Pickett's view of segregation nor the Cary Institute's view of urban ecology, which focuses upon making cities more sustainable, get me out of left field. My concern is not with cities as a source of racialized ecological damage, it is with suburbia. In thinking about how architects can practice to address the climate crisis, my concern is not with helping low-income and minority populations change their circumstances. It is with helping affluent and majority populations change theirs. Instead of focusing upon the environmental consequences of segregation for people of color, this lecture explores its detrimental consequences for affluent white populations who hold powerful positions within U.S. society, including the ability to shape the nation's landscape. To quote one of the children who pioneered school desegregation in New Orleans when the eminent child psychiatrist Dr. Robert Coles interviewed her, and this is a quote, "The rich folks are the ones who decide how the poor folks live. They cough and we feel the house shake." End of quote. Taking her words as my cue, this lecture focuses upon the rich folks. I begin by and that's us, right? I begin by presenting how racism and classism have distorted the American landscape and produced environmental cost far greater than any single building could. With this evidence as my rationale, I share how I have attempted to educate my mostly privileged architecture students to be more empathic in their approach to marginalized populations. I also share the hard lessons I have learned about bringing people together across difference, and end by speculating about how these lessons can inform the practice of architecture, hoping that I can get the ball to home base from way out in left field. So let's get started. Though I agree that urban areas are extremely segregated and that urban dwellers consume over 75% of the Earth's resources annually, New York City being an excellent example, my concern is centered in suburbia, where over half the American population live. Throughout the country, historically and in present times, that population has used its political power and the social capital that derives from racial privilege to distance itself from a population that is largely Black, lower income, and considered threatening to its privileged way of life. The consequences of residential segregation in the United States are indisputable, not just in urban areas, but nationwide. The government policies and practices that Richard Rothstein rigorously documented in The Color of Law drove the nation's ecologically damaging development patterns as more well-to-do, mostly white residents used exclusionary zoning codes to isolate themselves from lower income, mostly non-white ones. As an article by urban planners Igor Vojnovic and Joe T. Darden states, dispersed low-density patterns, and now I quote, facilitate greater environmental damage, higher levels of resource use, and the increased conversion of natural land to urban uses, higher infrastructure outlays, and greater social cost, including social isolation of the elderly. Additionally, these patterns result in, and this is another quote, resource-intensive transportation patterns, greater automobile dependence, greater infrastructure requirements, and increased energy use for heating and cooling buildings, end of quote. To bring the point home, the policies and practices of segregation create a place like Dutchess County, where 80% of residents drive a single occupant vehicle to work, and virtually no one uses public transportation. How many people in this room drove a single occupant vehicle to this conference? Right, because there's no other way to get here. So, yeah, you have to do that. In Detroit, the center of North America's auto industry, where 77% of the population is African American and the median income is only about $38,000, about 40% of the population has just one car or shares a car with someone. In Dutchess County, where 10% of the population is African American and the median income is 2.5 times that of Detroit at about $95,000, about 40% of the population has 2 cars, suggesting that the climate crisis is being driven by the dispersed, low-density development patterns in places like Dutchess County, where residents own more cars, live in larger houses, and produce up to 4 times the household emissions of their urban counterparts. This is the population that needs your attention. Residential segregation also drove America's present affordable housing crisis, which is connected to and exacerbated by the climate crisis. For example, a 2023 national study revealed record levels of housing poverty, major barriers to first-time home ownership, and increasing rates of homelessness, with people of color bearing a disproportionate share of these burdens. This crisis did not start with the current influx of migrants. It has been building since the 1970s era of white flight, when housing costs first began to rise faster than inflation. The tremendous increase in housing prices was caused in large part by the practice of exclusionary zoning that maintained enclaves of affluence, which left many working-class urbanites inadequately housed or unhoused altogether. The increased housing density that Jan campaigned for and lost would have addressed these exclusionary zoning practices, and they certainly should be a primary concern for architects at a symposium on the climate crisis. Finally, residential segregation imposed a colonial hierarchy upon the land, replacing an indigenous ethos of stewarding it with one of dominating it after settlers had already used chattel slavery to clear the land and make it produce much more than its normal carrying capacities. In place of First Peoples' spiritual relationships to all elements that sustain life, colonizers established land as a commodity to be bought and sold as real estate. In the face of the housing crisis, community land trusts that offer shared equity home ownership are rekindling the indigenous system of shared control, creating permanently affordable housing on communally owned land. Notably, shared equity housing helps address the vast racial differences in homeownership that exist. For example, whereas only 26% of all U.S. homeowners were people of color, 45% of shared equity homeowners were. People's spiritual relationship with the land and with each other through the land should certainly be a primary concern for architects at a symposium on the climate crisis. If architects are to address this crisis, they must go beyond considering how to design individual buildings like the Cary Institute and consider the context of such buildings. In addition to knowing how to select carbon-smart materials, they must have the skills and habits of mind to advance sustainable, integrated communities and be committed to upend race and class-driven development patterns. They must be champions of government policies and housing strategies that ensure stability and security for individuals and families. Be conversant in alternatives to using housing as a vehicle for accumulating wealth, and also have policymaking skills that can enable collectively owned, shared equity housing. Finally, they must make amends for the theft of indigenous lands by rejecting the consumerist colonial mindset that underpins their extractive use. They must have a critical awareness of indigenous relationships with the land, be committed to co-creating the conditions for indigenous sovereignty, and have the leadership skills to organize cooperative, regenerative models of coexistence. As a faculty member in some of the nation's top professional programs of architecture for almost half a century, this is my 49th year, I have attempted to prepare my students to advance integrated communities. Beyond equipping them with the technical and artistic skills and aptitudes that accreditation standards and school curricula spell out, I wanted my mostly privileged students to develop a first-hand understanding of the designed environment's inequities. I wanted them to understand that they could use design to transform those inequities, and above all, that they should give marginalized communities a voice in the transformative process. I have attempted to achieve these aspirations primarily through university community partnerships, which I began forming at the University of Michigan. Mercifully, I had the good sense not to get involved in such a risky way of teaching until I achieved tenure in 1987, or I would not be here today. And then I jumped feet first into Detroit and other rundown minority-populated locales undertaking an array of projects with my graduate architecture and planning students. Of course, none of them were from Detroit, but rather were from suburban and rural Michigan, where they had likely never encountered Black people and certainly not a Black teacher. However, over the years, I learned to guide my students through a participatory planning and design process in neighborhoods that were becoming increasingly ravaged. I continued this work at the University of Washington through a partnership I formed with Seattle's largest WMBE architecture firm. Known for its responsiveness to the city's historically African American neighborhood, its president and CEO frequently contributed pro bono services to nonprofit organizations, helping them leverage his firm's expertise to undertake community-controlled projects. To assist in these efforts, my graduate and undergraduate architecture students developed design alternatives, which we hoped would spark debate and perhaps even result in funding, which they sometimes did. Student reaction to my community-engaged pedagogy has been mixed. Some students have accused me of being too radical, too Black, too feminist, too narrowly focused upon inequity, while others say that I have changed their lives and offered them a new way of approaching architecture. Consequently, my teaching evaluations typically average out at about a 3. However, despite this long period of engaging students in low-income communities, I have never explored in a rigorous manner my community partners' reaction to working with the students. In fact, though a growing literature documents the promises and challenges of university community partnerships, it focuses primarily on their benefits to students and secondarily to the institution. Little, if any, literature exists on benefits to the community, which exemplifies the extractive approach to university community partnerships in majority institutions. In response to this gap in knowledge, when I began teaching at Parsons, I decided to explore how university community partnerships could equally benefit university students and community partners, and also build their mutual capacity to understand and address inequities in the designed environment. Last fall, I was fortunate to make a partnership with a former student who had founded an out-of-school program to expose young public housing residents to a career in architecture. Her program met weekly for 10 Sunday afternoons during both the fall and spring semesters and engaged about 24 New York City public housing residents in studying one of the city's public housing campuses. Professional mentors and undergraduate architecture student interns from City Tech University mentored the students in visualizing hypothetical design improvements for the campus. After my former student became a co-instructor in my Parsons studio, we developed a syllabus that specified 5 collaborative sessions out of the 10 she would offer through her program. In the first 4 sessions, the Parsons students would go to City Tech, present their in-progress proposals for improving the campus, and receive feedback from the public housing residents. Then the group would meet at Parsons to celebrate its work. During the sessions that the Parsons students did not attend, the residents would develop their own proposals using the design methods they were learning from their older counterparts. At the end of the school year, my research assistant recruited Parsons students, public housing residents, student interns, and professional mentors to participate in a study that aimed to assess the mutual benefits and drawbacks of the studio pedagogy. The study data revealed that conflicting norms and expectations created tensions and compromised the benefits to both the Parsons students and the public housing residents. For example, the professional mentors saw the residents as clients for the Parsons students' studio project, which suggested that the residents would play a role in deciding the direction of those projects. But the Parsons students rejected this notion, expected to be directed in their learning solely by the faculty. Another tension came from design norms that define creativity as recognizing the limitations of what exists in order to bring something new and original into being. However, the residents resisted the notion of seeing limitations in their housing in order to make something new and original. As one resident put it, and I quote, "They were telling me, like, just pretend, like try to detach yourself from there to be more creative. Like it's not that simple for me to do that," end of quote. I mean, this is my home. Despite these conflicting norms and expectations, the partnership had positive outcomes in bringing together a cross-section of people with different life experiences. And that is the primary benefit for universities and communities. My big takeaway from the research was that we needed to spend much more time simply building relationships among young people who occupy very different positions in architecture's sociocultural and economic hierarchy. As a result, this year we are using most of our time together to develop a collective vision of what the future should look like, rather than working on specific design proposals. And that is the advice I would give to you. To respond to the question of how architects can practice to address the climate crisis, I will end by using World Orchestra Week, or WOW, as a precedent. Perhaps some of you were lucky enough to hear one of the performances this last August, when 7 youth orchestras from around the globe came together to perform at Carnegie Hall. For 7 consecutive days, the exquisite music of over 700 teenagers from 38 countries, including Afghanistan, China, Germany, Israel, Nigeria, Ukraine, and the United States, filled this iconic hall as their individual statements of hope for a better world were projected on the walls in bold letters. WOW's producers expect that only about half of these talented musicians will become professionals. Career development is not their aim. But they are convinced that at a time of international strife and unrest, the experience of communal music making will forge life-changing connections and friendships that will help these young people make a difference in the world. Creating the conditions where rich folks and poor folks can share their hope for a more equitably designed environment should be the aim of architects' effort to address the climate crisis. At a time of perilous levels of housing poverty, climate change, and forced migration, just imagine an event in Cary's conference center that would bring together people who occupy very different positions in the region's sociocultural and economic hierarchy to develop a collective vision of living together in a more just and sustainable manner. Such communal placemaking would be terribly messy and likely test the limits of the code of behavior at the conference center. Yet, it may be the only way to change the hearts and minds of those who hold powerful positions within U.S. society, who create the ecologically damaging development patterns that are driving the nation's and the world's climate crisis. Thank you very much for listening to my plea from way out in left field for architects to turn their gaze from buildings to the context in which buildings exist and to refocus their efforts from addressing the consequences of poverty to addressing the consequences of privilege. Thank you very much for listening.
So it's great to be here today. I appreciate the invitation. I'm a bit jet lagged, so just bear with me if I start to kind of move a bit of a different direction. I've been in Eastern Europe working on the border of Ukraine for the past 2 weeks, working with cities and looking at their future as they transition and try to figure out what a resilient, sustainable future really looks like. I do need the tech folks up here one more time. You're going to give me the presenter's view on the screen, which I do not have. Are you guys still here? There you go. They're coming around. From presenter. Oh, great, perfect. See, now I can reference these notes, and with my jet lag, I'll actually be able to follow along what I'm supposed to be saying. So it is really great to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity. I do want to really talk a little bit about, just for 2 slides, about what's happening with the AIA. And it's really relevant to this conference, as was mentioned about the 2030 commitment. You probably heard about that earlier this morning. You know, the 2030 commitment is how are we supposed to reach net zero? And to Dr. Sutton's comments, I mean, the second slide really gives me hope that that some of the things that she's talking about really start to resonate inside our industry. But as fellow architects, we have these countless opportunities that you've seen all day today of how we can get to this idea of really reducing carbon and getting to a place where we are leading not just the conversation, but leading change. And I think it's important that when you have a chance to sign up for that commitment, over these past several years, just let me give you a few numbers they gave me, is that not only is this about tracking information, we now have double the signatures over the last 5 years for this program, which is 62,000 design professionals really driving towards this idea of net zero. We have almost 100,000 AI members, and we only capture just about half of what the number of architects in the US. So we still have a lot of work to do just collectively, whether you're inside the AIA or outside the AIA. This is what is really going to drive some serious change. The other thing that really gives me a lot of hope is many of you may be aware of the 10 design principles for the framework for design excellence. Now, this is really important because what this framework does, there are 4 things. It is really looking at getting to net zero, but it's also building resilient communities, healthy communities, and equitable communities. You must really drive towards all 4 of those pillars to get to what we all should be considering as design excellence. We've adopted that framework as our ethos. So equity in the built environment is just as important as getting to net zero. As important is to protect against the next storms through resilience. And this idea of health, healthy environments, 15-minute city, healthy materials, all of those things are encapsulated. So I encourage you to, again, take a look at this. The Design Awards programs throughout the AIA across the country now must adhere to these goals. So when we're evaluating projects, we're looking at, is this something that reaches excellence? It's not just the aesthetics. It has to be the performance. It has to be how it impacts communities. It must go beyond, because we have to answer the call which Dr. Sutton put forward and the work that Bruce is doing, and elevate ourselves to that place if we are going to make an impact globally. So that's my AIA couple of minutes. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about maybe why JC had me stop in and the Committee on the Environment, about some of the work that I'm engaged in. And I'm an architect and educator. I'm also a geographer. I'm also first generation born in this country from immigrants who were displaced by war. And it's shaped a lot of my career. And as mentioned, I'm really dedicated to bringing greater voice and visibility to underserved communities throughout the world. And the work that I've done across the world continues to this day, whether it's deploying after disasters or creating new models to be successful in preventing disasters or effects of disasters on communities, or training, or learning and engaging from indigenous wisdom to bring forward a new future that really relies on some of the amazing work that's out there. And my office has had good fortune to really work all over the world. We deliver projects everywhere, and when we deliver these projects, we engage in a circular economy. We hire locals to do the work. We hire locals to execute the drawings. We partner with local architects to make sure that they are the ones overseeing the work, doing the work. It may sound like, oh, well, of course, we do that as well. But I mean, when I'm doing the drawings, we're doing some projects in Hawaii currently. We're hiring young architects out of Hawaii to form a new office satellite to do the work. So when we say circular economy, the work and the money stays there. We try to do that with all of the environmental controls, all of the materials, the labor that goes into our projects. We want those contracts to read that you are using local labor. You have to train local labor, so that money, and you develop a workforce. So when you see these dots, a lot of these are projects that have helped bring new workforces, skills, and keep money in those places. So the outline for today, it really is about, I want to describe a little bit about the storm that we're in. We've been hearing a lot about carbon reduction and those things. I want to take that with climate action in the different kind of a direction. And then we talk a little bit about successes, and how we define community. Because this is about community. How do we define our community? And I ask you to think about, how do you define your own design team? And on the right of the slide, it's really important that we notice, since the global climate talks began, really, in the last century, global emissions have gone up, parts per million in the atmosphere have gone up, temperatures have gone up, even though we're talking more and more and more and more. So what does that begin to tell us? It begins to tell us that increased action is necessary, but we are also in this place that we are sharing the same storm, because we are all in the same storm. You know, we need to understand that to navigate this storm, the nature of it, and so this is a bit about the nature of it. We need to understand that enduring shocks and stresses from hurricanes and tornadoes are not just subject to a single place on Earth, that tropical storms and how we lose capacity, family, community, in addition to flooding, usually followed by drought, addressing resource stress that is often hitting the most vulnerable communities around the world that can ill afford to lose just a moment of that resource. From earthquakes across the world, whether it's in Turkey, where I was deployed last year, or Nepal, with losses of housing and infrastructure, that's all in the wheelhouse of what architects do in terms of systems thinking and integration. And this idea of loss of livelihood follows each one of these. So when you think about climate action, I want you to think about these things, because it's not just those shocks and stresses that are happening at a greater pace. It's the chronic events that are increasingly more common, placing millions of vulnerable people around the world at risk. So remember the Paris Agreement. We all agreed, 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're going to cap that, and that's where we're going to go. In that agreement, if you really do the studies, 1.5 degrees Celsius means 350 million more people will be displaced by sea level rise just at 1.5. Yeah, we agreed to displace 350 million extra people. That is the subtext of that. That is the people who we are experiencing that loss today. So let's think about that. In fact, let's go a little bit further, because this is the storm. Every minute of every day, 24 people are displaced around the world from natural and man-made disasters. That's extraordinary. Stronger, better communities, the work that you do, keep those people in place and will stop that tide, can change that story. Last year alone, we had over 100 million people displaced for the very first time in human history. In a single calendar year, 114 million people at a cost of $236 billion in reported losses. Most of the world does not operate on an insurance basis. So all of the places where I work in developing countries and communities at risk, you don't have a value placed on that. So this $236 billion is to infrastructure and buildings that have insurance values and reported losses. It does not include the farmer and his or her equity that was completely lost on the island of Dominica. It doesn't include any of that economic number at all. So when we think about this, we have to think about the storm that we're in is well beyond what we're thinking it is. It's affecting people at much greater rates than we can possibly imagine. So, you know, the climate impacts, natural disasters, as I said, are affecting all of our communities. In fact, the most recent one, Hurricane Helene, you know, this is pretty extraordinary. Just last week, 400-mile pathway from Florida to Asheville, North Carolina, 15-foot high storm surge at the coastal area. At least 223 people lost their lives. And that destruction has wrought incredible, incredible damage. And we're here to talk about community and climate action, right? So I'm wholeheartedly in this. I respond to disasters, I train disaster responders, and I've been deployed to many of these places. These are the communities that we serve as architects. It does not respect political boundaries when a disaster or storm comes. It has no respect for that whatsoever. Doesn't matter who you're voting for, where you're voting, what you're doing, it will hit you. But what does matter is that you as architects understand the pathway to create sustainable, resilient, holistic communities, that when they're hit by disasters, they can lessen the effect, save the lives, and bounce back really quickly. So when we think about climate action, I want to go that direction. And we're not alone. It's not just us in the US. It's the almost 4 billion people across the earth that are living in climate hotspots. 4 billion people, that's half the world's population, according to the IPCC report. That report confirms the future global crises include heat stress, water scarcity, food security, and flood risk. And you're asking, well, we're architects. Why are you talking about this? Well, because we are systems thinkers. We are systems thinkers, and you can understand the simultaneity of compound events that, yes, okay, there's heat stress. You know what that means at the local level? That means that all the food prices go up, all kinds of things go up, and everything in between to the societal impacts are so extraordinary. And they could be very far away. We call that upstream, the upstream disaster. Well, why are my food prices so expensive now? Well, because of these events or because of something else. We have to really think about that and apply our craft, our knowledge, and our expertise to these issues. Because everyone in attendance today are going to experience these extraordinary changes that are going to drive this even further. Your children, your grandchildren, your neighbors, find yourself on this chart and you will see where you will lie throughout your life, and by the end of the century, the extraordinary circumstances that we are living, this storm. But 2023 showed us that the numbers of natural disaster are on the rise, but the fact is they're going to triple in the next generation. In the next 20 years, it's not going to be the one Hurricane Helene, it's going to be the 3 Hurricane Helenes, followed by the next one, and the next 3, and the next 5. So we're also looking at the 114 million people displaced this last year, and that's going to increase unless we as architects do something about the built environment. So yes, reduce carbon, but yes, we must do the other side of the coin. So the economic yearly loss in the past 30 years has doubled. So now we start to think about, well, so the businesses do have to close down. That livelihood, all of those employees don't have their jobs. So all of those families suffer, right? I'll give you an example. After Hurricane Maria in the US Virgin Islands, most of this is a tourism economy. The hotels had insurance so they could actually close and still receive what their annual income was based on operations. That's their insurance. They received the money, but they did not have to pay their employees that money. They took that money, renovated the hotels, and all the employees were out of work for years. So when we think about equity and we start to think about those things, how do we address that social ill in our work, right? Just let's think about that. So how do we define community? So here's the way that FEMA defines a community. So in your work as architects and you're doing projects, my encouragement to you is to start to think about the community lifelines. How am I addressing these things in my small project to large projects that hit all of the federal guidance, or meaning the federal areas that, do I have secure and safe energy? No, I need some backup energy. Great, because each one of these also says that there is a federal pot of money that will help you reinforce these areas so community does not fail. Think about that. I have a project, and I'm always thinking about fragility. It was great to see all the amazing things that Bruce was putting out there that supported his project financially. We find them all the time for every piece of the project that gives us slack in the system or redoubles the efforts or backup systems that ensure that our projects at the community level have some not only survivability, but can thrive through disasters and help the rest of the community as anchors. So think about these things. And they're splitting off water as the most essential resource in the world as its own one. So this will soon turn into 8 in the federal guidelines. Sanitation water as well as clean drinking water. So resilient communities are adaptive communities. And when we plan and rebuild after disasters, communities have to adapt to thrive to that future. And to get there, it's not just the science. We have to go beyond the science to get to healing, because healing is about society and social ills. Most communities already know the issues that they face, and so when you do this work, great, I can rebuild that, I can put up a new structure here, I can protect from flooding. Really? That's great. Did you talk to the community about it? Did you talk to the community about where, why, and what the chronic ills of the community were before you get to this idea of what a new city is or what a new town is? Those are the things that we need to do better at. You know, it's a holistic approach to design, and as architect-led adaptation touches many of the sustainable development goals across the world. If you remember, I said 1.5 degrees Celsius. These are the categories that we all agree to as nation states. So even though cities are just one of them, they're all interconnected. And you can see everything from clean drinking water and no poverty and zero hunger. All of these things are part of your work whether you like it or not. And some of you may really like that it is part of our work, because it is. We are part of the whole of society, and we could make the whole of society better through that work. So as part of our shifting around at COP27, JC mentioned I was at COP28, I was also at 27, that was the first time that the world said, remember Paris, 1.5 degrees Celsius, we're going to have another landmark something, which is called the Sharm el-Sheikh Agreement. They recognize the disasters are coming so fast, we have to change global financing to move towards adaptation. So these communities that I'm talking about, that we make them resistant to these disasters, is funded globally. So there's a commitment to build and retrofit and adapt for 4 billion people across the planet. That's a lot of work. Who leads that work? Architects. Architects lead that work. So there are 4 billion people that need your work. There are 4 billion clients out there, and the first question as a business owner, well, where's the banking and finance for that? Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, I'm glad I asked, I don't know. So once that happened, global adaptation was only 2% of global funding around the world for climate action. Everything was about carbon and sanitary water and all of those pieces, but nothing was about building better buildings and hardening infrastructure. It was saying, let's go to an energy transition, but it wasn't saying, does that energy transition hold up to high winds? So it stays operating. So it quickly moved from 2%, now it's then it went to 9% at the beginning of this year. Now it is at 11.5%. So global banking and financing is moving very, very rapidly to do the work that I'm talking about. It's the majority of the work that my office does around the world gets financed this way, okay? The other piece is that biodiversity and ecosystem services, meaning places like this that underpin ecologies, are now an absolute minimum for work that's being done around the world. Restoring ecologies as part of your architectural work is now required. If you're doing work for the World Bank or development funds, grant funds, whatever it may be, they want to see what the ecosystem services and enhancing that means at the end of your project. But if you really want to take a look at the numbers, the Global Center on Adaptation really illustrates the financial need around the world. And I'm not going to go through all these numbers, but look, you know, if you just look at the $500 billion needed annually just for adaptation of buildings, that money is rapidly coming forward through the banking and finance systems around the world. And who's driving that is the insurance providers, because they're tired of paying out after disasters. But the other people who are driving it are communities that I work with on remote islands that are sinking, or actually, you know, the oceans are swallowing them up, and they're losing the ability to be a society. They're losing their culture, their place of life, their way of life. We can't let that happen. We have to do something new. So, whoops. All right, come on, show. Keep going. And the other thing for this year, another tool that I'll send along to you, these are new financing tools for adaptation, mitigation, ecosystem services. They came out earlier this year. This is basically a roadmap. If you are interested in this work, you can get a hold of this. You can find banking and finance partnerships to do large work and small work just about anywhere in the world. They're interested in really giving you a playbook, and they're interested in activating the AEC industry to take this up. They're interested in state players who don't have design services engage us to do the work. That's pretty phenomenal, because in the end, what we have to do is that work will invest in marginalized groups across the world for equity and justice. And what's proven is that if we support the wider benefits of adaptation are supported through all of this work, we decrease poverty, we promote healthy communities, reduce inequity, and promote life and land on the water through our work. And that's a great economy to promote. It actually just matched the framework for design excellence, just in that. And so the world has agreed, you know what, AIA, your framework for design excellence is amazing. Oh, by the way, We need you to do it now. And we'll give you all the money to do it if you're willing to engage in community development that is actually listening to the people who need the work done. And that's where we're at. So to summarize that portion is really, these are the reports that I put out there. But that little red place is the pinch point where architects dwell. Global needs and sustainable, resilient future have been illustrated from, COP 15 all the way through now we're going into COP 29. We've got global commitments for resilient sustainability, for equity, for all of these things. And every community has studies. They have all of the work ready to go. They just have not translated into architectural work. And global financing is waiting to spend the money. There's the pinch point. That's you. That's us. That's the AEC industry. People are screaming, where are you folks? There are 600 cities that are currently retrofitting all of their hospital and health systems to meet the goals that have been stated by the UN. They have global financing to do it for 600 cities across the world. I was the first architect at COP 28 last year. It's like, wait, do you have any architects on board for this? And this was a panel of all doctors that have advocated for this and said, no, we don't. And it was great because the whole coalition from AIA was there. We had a great conversation. We are now sitting on those groups to talk about how do you retrofit hospital systems in 600 cities in the developing world with all of this financing, and they don't have enough architects to do it. So stay tuned, right? So now on to the whole overarching goal. For me, I believe resilience and sustainability are two sides of the same coin. If you do those together, if you stop the disasters of today while reducing the carbon of tomorrow, you will create equity in communities like you've never seen before. We will have a building boom, but we'll also have a cultural renaissance in our cities, in our small towns, to bring forward these things that we all hold dear. So many of you know about the 2030 challenge, but the other side of that coin, for example, this is mitigation. The other side is the 2030 challenge of the Sendai Agreement. So if you want those goals on balance with the work that you're doing, there's a great series of things here that this is all about disaster risk reduction. And this is about reducing mortality, reducing the number of affected people globally, all of the things that you do. All of the countries around the world have agreed to this, along with the other things, okay? And then there's a great crosswalk of how all of the goals work together. So if you're working in this, then great. But that brings me to the last piece of this. Remember, this is supposed to be about community building. So I want to take you down to the level of what do you think about community and how do you identify community for your projects? Now, some of these are very traditional, like, well, there's the individual owners and there's existing development, new development, the building and site, and we come down to then the neighborhood, community organizations, neighborhood communities, coalitions, and organizations. Are these part of your design process? Some of them may be, some of them maybe not. Regional and public agencies when you get to the city level, and then owners, developers, large scale. The one that's typically missed is that middle one. It really is. How do you bring people on board to inform a design process similar to what Dr. Sutton was talking about that gets them out of the comfort zone, and you have raucous events that people are yelling at each other, but their goals are the same. I want a better future. And that is kind of the work that we end up doing. So, adaptation happens at the speed of trust. And I want you to remember that because the work that we do this is the island of Dominica after Hurricane Maria. It took years for us to gain the trust of the local indigenous people, the Kalinago people. And working by being there shoulder to shoulder and understanding not just the community needs, the community culture and understanding where they want to go, we had to listen, learn, and we keep learning. Learn about one important term for them. It's called kudme. Kudme means we all pull together because similar to what was mentioned before, there is no ownership of land. There is just a custodial nature over it and pulling together, but they all share resources that way. The interesting thing is they have no way of banking and finance to unlock funding that I've mentioned for them. So what we did was we set up a not-for-profit called the Global Institute for Resilience and Regeneration, made sure that the board of directors is 51% Kalinago people, and then we have advisors like myself, and we've gone after global funding that they could never receive before. Now they have funding coming in, everything from $250,000 grants to much larger, to restore ecosystems, to rebuild roads, to do things, put education centers together, having learning for the younger people about their history and culture. And it just took a systems thinking of a few architects and the ability to listen to people who already knew the solutions to their problems. So you're a translator. So this is one good project, but adaptation happens at the speed of trust. It took a few years, but now they're really moving quite well. So the community engagement part, it's interesting that we all know the science behind it. We know the impacts that are today, the impacts that are going to be tomorrow, extreme heat, all of those things. That's just the beginning, because the true resilience starts with this community engagement type. And this quote that is here, "My community is self-aware, self-actualized, and invisible," was the attitude of these 7 North Shore Hawaiian villages to the state government. Because they're invisible, they have because they don't have a large tax base, nobody in government's really willing to spend a dime on them to actually make sure their roads work or their electricity works or anything like that. So you may go as a tourist to Hawaii and, hey, this all looks great. Not if you live there and you're a native Hawaiian, that's for sure, no way. The US government is still technically at war with the native Hawaiians. They never signed a treaty. So they do not benefit from any of the Native American programs. And in fact, the government uses that often as a leverage to get them to sign something that was offered them 100 years ago. So think about that. If you work with marginalized groups, these are an in-between marginalized group, yet they are still the largest population in the state. And my 7 communities, between 80 to 90% of them identify at least one parent being Native Hawaiian, if not both. So we've worked on this very hard to change what's happening with these villages. And so when we think about that team organization, the Ko'ololoa Resilience Hub project, we began to identify all of the assets that were in those talk stories, in those initial meetings, to see how far the community actually reached. And they reached really far as a community, because the thing about Native Hawaiians is everything is about family interrelationships. So they could have family interrelationships globally that began to shape our project design team. And this has really helped the project. But the other thing is that communities have a face. In this case, they talk about the community has not had a voice, saying that they were invisible, that the community engagement, getting together, talking, sharing, laughing, hurting together, whatever it is, builds bonds in the communities that they do not want to lose. But it also has a future of the community through the youth. So engaging the youth as well is not just the business owners, it's everybody. When we talk about sustainability and sustaining our life, I believe helping to sustain our culture is important. Culture became one of the major themes that is eroding in many of these places. Yet marrying indigenous wisdom to modern technology is the key to a sustainable, resilient, regenerative future. The custodial nature of indigenous people, they understand how to very, very well to leverage ecosystem services into incredible pieces of architecture that repair the earth by their being. And we don't have time to talk about that today, but we'll talk a bit more. And then, of course, there's voices of the people. This is Ronnie here on the left. We may be poor, but we're rich in our culture. This is why we still hang on, why we still do what we do. We fight for the next generation so they don't forget their culture. They don't forget where they're from and where their roots are. So when I say community as part of your design, it is so extraordinarily important. It took us years to be invited to the inner circle of these tables, but it's this years of being present, working side by side. These are the current partners for the Resilience Hub. This community started with no money to do this Resilience Hub. Through their hard work, our engagement with them, translating, they now have just broken ground with this project. Senate earmarks have given them just over $5.5 million for the horizontal infrastructure. We have also put together, through all this hard work, FEMA brick grants, planning grants, millions and millions of more dollars just through hard work and having architects like myself and my team translate their goals. Their design, it's their co-design, love that word, to get us to this place. But these are all the people who are on board to infuse into this place, but also to give support. Verizon is building a hardened communications center there. The city of Honolulu, as an island, is considered a single city, is putting an emergency operations center there. So when we think about this is about collective action. And many of you know this, so collective action. I can work with one client and say, we're gonna do a blue roof program, but if I have the ability to engage one community, my impact is enormous. Or if I do one house, I give it away so everybody else takes it up. So this idea of collective action is the big impact. And if it's not just about one thing, it could be about another. It could be about microgrids, equity in energy transformation of places. So you already know the impact of collective action, but think about that when you bring communities into the conversation to inform your projects. That is essential because you will have a more powerful project than you could ever imagine, have ever thought about to begin with. Because ultimately, we have, everyone has a role on this team. So I want to ask now is, given this framework that I've given you, you have to ask yourself, who are the members of your team? Traditionally, we have AEC teams, right? We have architects, engineers, we have a few consultants, maybe we bring in a few community leaders. I'm suggesting it's much more than that, right? In our projects, we bring on historians, geographers, marine biologists, native trades, builders, anthropologists, community leaders, community historians. Ideally, Ideally and essentially, multi-sector engagement is key. Identifying the stakeholders in the short term for long-term considerations is ideally what you're doing. Native peoples all around the world, in one way or another, have said this. When you are planning with us, we are not considering planning for today. That's great. We've always had the ethos. Whatever you're building today is not for today, it's for tomorrow. Because you better be projecting for tomorrow if you're building. Your building's gonna be here 100 years or more, we hope, right? Every indigenous community, whether in the South Pacific or whether in the Caribbean or we're starting to do work in Alaska, they all say the same thing. We plan 7 generations in the future when we make choices for our community. Think about that. So what are we gonna do with this new school we're developing for kindergarten? That's what they're thinking about. They're thinking 7 generations into the future. As architects, we can learn from that. We project 100 years. They're projecting 140 as a minimum for everything they decide on. So that's pretty amazing. So part of the community, and you're part of a community of practice, which is part of the puzzle, but here's a few things that we end up doing. We embrace the active learning and to build that trust. Remember, adaptation happens at the speed of trust. We have to learn local practices, and having, as I said, the horticulturalists and environmentalists with us. This is me and my engineering team in Hawaii. The engineering team is G70, they're located in Hawaii. And because our project has to handle extreme weather events and water mitigation for flooding, we went to an active restoration of an ahupua'a, which is a native Hawaiian settlement that leverages water harvesting to fulfill its agricultural needs. And we're implementing all of this on our site. So I personally, with my architects, had to learn how to do this hands-on so we understand how to implement this into a project. I wanted to do that because I think it's necessary as an architect. This is my material and method. I need to understand this. But what it did was, they're not afraid to get in the dirt and the mud with us as Native Hawaiians and learn what this is. This built more trust with the community than anything you can possibly imagine. So think about that. And then, I keep saying community, but community is on your team, young and old, to ensure that the future is those 7 generations in the future. So this is me and deployed by the US Department of State or State Department. This is southern Turkey last year. Most of these kids lost family members. Sorry. Just a great group of kids, but very hard to hear their stories. Yeah, but sometimes you have to hear those stories to make a better future. Their own government, the Central Turkish government, is not listening to the families that lost their livelihoods, lost their families. They're only putting up buildings without considering what a master plan is, nor even listening to the community elders of what a sacred space look like, what all of these areas look like. We've done advocacy work, and the federal government has sent me there on many occasions now to work on behalf of those communities. And we have made some headway, and that's been good. Much more work to do. So, and I just want to introduce you one of my favorite people that's on our team. This is Tuoni. He happens to be, he looks like a little bit rough around the edges, and he is, but he is considered the master carver of all of the Polynesian cultures. He is the master carver. And he heard about the work we were doing. I got introduced to him, and we hit it off. He now is part of our project design team. He's identified indigenous materials that are going to be used in the project for interior finishes, all those things. He's opening a carving school ahead of when our project is done to teach the youth indigenous carving. And then when the project is finished, he is investing his time and effort to open a permanent carving school on our 5-acre site. So these are the type of people that I'm great having engineers and MEPs and everybody on board, but I'm more interested in adding these folks to this type of work that we must do as a profession. This is the project in Hawaii that we're doing. I presented it last, as JC said, 2 years ago. This is based on one of their project, or this is based on Talk Story, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but this is an indigenous va'a, which is a canoe that's been turned over. Traditionally, families would harbor underneath during a storm, when a storm would come. So we took that as an idea to begin to have the community recognize for themselves their own stories in the work that we're doing. This was unanimously voted as this is what we want to do, and now this is what's going to be built as one of the 3 buildings. And then if they're not part of your team, you look for inspirational leaders. People that I'm sharing a panel with, inspirational leaders. People who spoke this morning, inspirational leaders. Here are a couple of my inspirational leaders. On the right is Mama Maria. She organized 10,000 women farmers in Papua New Guinea and brought them all out of poverty by organizing how they grew their product to an ecologically restorative way, because the way that they did it before is they would grow and then they would have to leave the land fallow for 3 years before they could grow again, so they have to rotate crops. She completely changed how they do their work, and now this is 10,000 families that have been risen out of poverty, that have profitable business, that they have collective organizational efforts to do trade and sales. So she is an inspirational leader to me, because here's someone who engaged community, made holistic change for the betterment of society and the world. How do I do that in my architecture? And that's Tadia Rice in the middle, who is a woman for marginalized women throughout the Pacific. And she has podcasts and engagements globally. She does all these amazing things. The way she talks about equity in the future and stakeholder relationships has been inspirational to me. So look for inspiration where you can find that inspiration and bring that into your practice. And lastly, I always come back to this idea of community. The most satisfying part of my work is that I'm expanding family. Every project that I do, I feel as though I brought in new family members and I become part of other families, not just the folks in Hawaii where we started. That was our first meeting. My wife Christy's here. This is the first meeting we had, and this was last fall when we just cleared the land and they were having quote unquote hayrack rides across the 5 acres that was cleared of invasive species, which left 5 trees standing. So I think we're kind of out of time. So be the change with your community. I was just putting this in. This is a passive house we're doing in Massachusetts. It also is hurricane strong house. It's the first fortified house in Massachusetts. And when this is finished, the governor's office will come and take a look at the house, and then we give the plans away online to proliferate our community of excellence, to make sure others can understand you can do this work too, whether it's small or large. Thank you very much.
Well, if anybody has a peering question, you can raise your hand, and when we're right after this. But I did want to just again thank everyone for participating. I have a lot of questions myself. I would like to maybe start out by thinking about the big picture and maybe what some of the overlapping messages in all of your talks were, in sort of like, at least as I see it, which is how do we all contribute to the next generation? And in other words, sitting back for a second as we all get older, life is short, and we have our role on this earth can be influential and can be very influential. And I find today's speakers to have given a great influence to our profession. And I think in each way, I would love for you to talk about how you feel your work and our work as architects can gravely push the envelope, as I said, toward the next generation to make things better for the following generations, things that we may not even be here to perceive one day.
That's a big question, but actually maybe the most important one. And I know in my own practice, I'm starting to realize that it's more important that we share information and help engage whatever community we're in to alert folks to the urgency of the problems we're facing, both for decarbonizing, but also creating resilience. And it's hard to do that sort of one building or one client at a time. I think we have to, architects are always working locally, but now we have a global problem, which there are not enough architects to solve the problem. So we have to develop systems and networks and communities of communities, which I think is what I found so inspiring about this panel, is that the two people to my left are thinking both with the entire AIA and with entire systems of communities to solve these problems. So the problems are bigger than any one of us can solve. But I'm encouraged and optimistic that with this kind of thinking that we can get our arms around it. I don't know.
Nice question. You know, I'm 83 and a half, and so I'm getting to the end. And I don't think so much about how I can contribute, but how I can enable others to contribute. I mean, I've been very, very lucky in my life to have gotten opportunities just by being at the right place at the right moment, including, you know, this conference that JC organized. It was just, I was just at the right place. And so I feel a real urgency to pay it back, or I guess it's paying it forward. And I want to mostly, I think the answer for the future is not in my head, it's in the heads of the young people who are coming up. And so giving them the courage to face all of the problems is my job. And also supporting them. I just spent a lot of time trying to help people who are not so young get their fellowship, because they're doing important work, and if they have that credential, they'll be more empowered to do the work. So I really see that my contribution is supporting other people who are coming, who are standing on my shoulders.
Wow. It's hard to follow that, because that is exactly right. In my opinion, I think, you know, engaging the young people is, look, I guess I'll put it in different terms. I have two kids that don't see the future the way we all grew up seeing the future. We saw endless horizons. We saw a future that we could do anything, be anything, if we just, because there was no looming threat of what we're seeing on the screen that all of us showed in a certain way. So one is to empower them to do the work, as was just stated. And I think doing that by that supportive role is extraordinary, but I think also we have to do, as who we are as architects, better at not passing this on to the next generation, to be working with every fiber of our being on this problem today, tomorrow, and beyond. Open the doors for those younger people to take it up and show us the way for innovation, because they think that we have left this problem for them. They think that we are not interested in solving the problem, that we are throwing our hands up saying, well, you know, that's it. You guys, good luck. We have to do that in a completely different way. So this, when Dr. Sutton says enabling and support, I wholeheartedly agree with that, but let's recognize the territory that we're stepping into. They have no faith in us. We have to restore that. So this idea of adaptations happens at the speed of trust, restoring the trust in us as the ones who, as a generation, the last couple of generations that have done the worst to the planet, we are there to turn it around, and we need them to help us, and then we need to help them continue after us.
To be the elders.
Thank you very much. So, second question I'd like to pose. I'm not an academic, I'm not a developer, I am a small practitioner in the Hudson Valley. And I'm curious how many people here are small practitioner owners? So, a good number, and that's our profession, right? And I find it that often that small practitioners have very little leverage. And sometimes the leverage we have is when government policies do require property owners to hire us. And one of the sub-themes of this talk, I would argue, is government intervention, government policy. How does government help push the envelope, right? And I'd like you all to talk about that, because to what extent how can we get the government to be more proactive? Although it's moving that way, certainly, but you talked, Bruce, about how in New Haven people are protesting the City Hall to get buildings to be less fossil fuel oriented, I think. So why don't you talk about how do we get the government to help us do the job that we'd like to do, but we can't do?
Yeah, I think that there's an important role for architects to testify in the state houses for legislation that recognizes the urgency of this problem. Unfortunately, we're often outgunned by home builders and the fossil fuel industry, and they've got a lot of resources to protect their interests, which are not the interests of everyone else in the world. So I think that we have to learn how to move out of our lane, and maybe there's in Connecticut, there's the public utility regulatory authority. They have hearings. We have to submit testimony that these things are doable and necessary. If there's legislation, we have to do that. And actually, probably the single most important thing is voting in this upcoming election for folks that are going to be concerned about the planet, because that's probably the most powerful type of collective action, because things are not going in the right direction. I also think that, I have had plenty of private clients, and I've also had the luxury of being my own developer, and I recognize that it's much easier if you're designing your own house or if you're a developer to make all these important decisions. But I would challenge those of you who think that the developer gets to call the shots, that not to cede that control, and to be emboldened. You can do it in a gentle way by saying, okay, I'm a little worried. I know that there's legislation on the horizon that is going to start penalizing people for using fossil fuels. Even for single family houses, there's going to be a day that comes. We're talking about carbon taxes. Could you sign this piece of paper if you don't want to spend the extra money for the heat pump? I just don't want you to come back and sue me for putting this in, or sue my engineer. I think that people are risk averse, developers are risk averse, and we have the information that maybe they don't have. So let's not get caught in the situation where 5 years from now we regret not taking a firmer line with our clients, because I think that at the end of the day they'll be grateful that we've been direct, not only for making sure that the buildings we're designing don't contribute to the problem, but also making sure that they're resilient enough to persist in the advent of it.
I'm not hopeful that the government is the source of change. There's sort of a pendulum. There have been times in US history that the pendulum has moved the government in a more liberatory direction, but then it just goes right back because it reflects majority opinion. And majority opinion is not on the side of justice. So I'm much more hopeful about the interventions that you described, and I was especially hopeful about the getting global financing to help local communities drive change. I don't think the government is the source of change. I think we can vote and get the least bad option. But I think that, it's about getting votes. It's not about getting a just society. So the people that you're working with and finding funding for those people, that is where I would put my money.
Yeah, it's a great question. So JC, keep bringing the softballs. These are great questions. We have this saying about disasters, all disasters are local, meaning all responses are local. So when you think about how government can be your help, I would look to your work to say, my project is a tangible touchstone for any government official that objects to or has a question about whether these projects can answer the needs of net zero, resilient, equitable, and healthy. Those are all great. And your project as a touchstone is something that no other profession out there can advocate with. So you do a nice, great, beautiful small house that's a passive house and it can take disasters, you will open eyes and you will change the thinking about your local government into the value proposition of what architecture is. And I also think that, International Code Council, every code cycle keeps getting better and better and better to energy and efficiencies, all these things. Is it directly engaging the government, or is it really looking at the power with what we have as the largest professional design industry in the world and say, International Code Council, we need to accelerate this, we need to do this, we need to do this. So government regulation becomes our sort of best support. Every code cycle means that we're already getting closer to net zero construction. We're getting to massive efficiencies. New York State, you guys all design here. Holy cow, 10 years ago, completely different landscape. We are getting there. So I think if we think about all disasters are local, then maybe our leverage is with our work, and secondly, our leverage is with our allies in the building industry that are setting policy standards that are adopted by the government. I'm not going to try to convince it. Well, I've been in front of Congress a couple of times noting how good buildings are and what they do, and had some good effect with that. But I think the better effect is when we use the advocacy tools that are about the science, the facts, and our buildings that get us to a place that change is inevitable, the absolute minimum. Clients will complain to us, why do I have to put solar panels in? Well, it's the law. It's your absolute minimum. That's a good thing to say to someone instead of having to advocate for, well, don't you want a net zero building? Don't you want this stuff? It becomes minimum. So I think if we think about it from the government side, it's that. On the other end, I think the financing is there. There is 26 federal agencies that wrote a climate action plan. 26 of them, all of them have climate action plans, and they need architects to execute it. So if you want to do government work, everyone from the Department of Defense, Department of Health, they all wrote these at the onset of the Biden administration, and they're struggling to spend their money. Just saying, how much of it is us educating ourselves on how to unlock the funds to do the work that's necessary? I think there's a lot of it there. I think the national organization, we should be in a position to help you find that money because it's there, and it's a lot of money. When it goes unspent, it just rolls to the next cycle, and then they don't spend it again. So I think the money is out there. The will to do it is out there. There's a mandate by all of the government bodies, but I think we have to do better on our own end.
Before I ask another question, does anyone have a question from the audience? Christina?
So the question, I think, is what architects can do to promote equity, for there to be more inclusiveness and collective life. Many things. I think, changing hearts and minds is the primary thing to work on. And, that can be with young people, but it can also be with older people, to just have a different vision of what you can do. And the thing is, how can you make a living changing hearts and minds? I mean, that's the dilemma for me. Of all the things that I recommended that we do, of, finding a way to promote communities that are regenerative, how do you make a living doing that? Well, we just got some ideas that you can make a living if you know where the source of funding is. So I think first is to develop, I'm a big advocate of critical pedagogy, which was a method of thinking put forward by Paulo Freire, a Brazilian educator. And he talked about people getting together and developing a critical awareness of their circumstances, then developing the tools, the strategies for changing their circumstances, and then taking collective action. And as I listened to Illya's presentation, he exactly went through Paulo Freire's methodology of critical pedagogy, that you first have to become critically aware of what's wrong, what is the problem, and then developing your tools. Who's the community? Who can we bring into this to collaborate with us? Where can we get the money to solve the problem? And then what collective action? And it has to be collective action. Because you can have all the codes that you want. It's not going to change anything just applying the codes. You have to have a purpose that you're applying the codes for. So I think awareness, strategies, collective action. It's a cycle that you keep doing it over and over again because you get better at the process.
I think maybe the lesson I'm hearing is we have to step outside of our normal routine. If we're just doing client work of marketing, getting the assignment, doing the design we're asked to do, closing it out, and then going to the next one. We have to engage with others, work cooperatively for community action, which may have nothing to do with designing things, but it may have to do with talking to neighbors and addressing a common problem. I haven't had anywhere near as much opportunity to do that as the two of you have, but I did, for a project I did in New Haven, we needed a grocery store. There was no downtown grocery store, so we formed a food co-op that eventually had over 2,000 members, and suddenly the city had a grocery store with affordable food. But no one asked me to do that. It was something that I thought, well, here's a project, we need a grocery store, and I visited about 20 other co-ops to figure out how it was done. So part of the thing that's neat about that is we get to learn new things, and as we get older, that keeps us young.
Wonderful. I'll take another question. I wanted to step in with another question of mine. Just anecdotally, I'm from the Hudson Valley now, but I was originally from the city. And when I got to the Hudson Valley, I learned more about the cleanup of the Hudson River, which was a monumental task, if anyone knows the history of the Hudson River. It was a task that no one could foresee. And through the vision of Pete Seeger and his friends, that transformed. Obviously, it transformed little by little at a snail's pace, but it transformed itself, and then eventually with government's help. And it's a story that I love telling because it's very inspirational to me, because I see it as something architects maybe can do for themselves. And I have my own projects where I'm trying to encourage the city of Beacon to do things that I hope the community will get behind. But I wonder, you know, what your experiences are in those challenges. A few years ago, I was working with architects that weren't members of the AIA. We're doing a 27-story tower, hotel in Manhattan, and the client considered lead for about 2 seconds, and the architects that were in charge didn't advocate. I was, you know, very disillusioned that there was not even any, this is 10 years ago, any passion to try to convince this firm from Spain to do a lead building in Manhattan. And it was just squashed after about 2 seconds. And so, so those are the stories that I also have dealt with in my career. And I'm wondering, you know, how do you like constantly continue on when you have all these challenges?
You know, I even with the experience I have, I don't think I could find a client to hire me to design a LEED hotel. It's just there are only 10 LEED Platinum hotels in the United States, and the hotel world is at the other end of the spectrum. Although I think that a personal connection with someone who was on that team, maybe with some shared experiences, could turn things around. But it's hard to persuade folks that you don't have common values with, and maybe I don't have a good answer for that, and it's frustrating. And that's really what led me to go out and be my own client for things. And I think architects often assume that they have to find a client to hire them to do something they want, but sometimes you can do it yourself. I mean, I've formed 3 different nonprofits. Years ago, we redeveloped the Times Square to develop Times Square Hotel to develop the largest supportive housing project with a bunch of friends, because there was no nonprofit around to do that. And so maybe it's really through collective action that you can accomplish a lot more than you can accomplish yourself.
Yeah, I think you're getting at some of the strategies. So, JC, to your point, sometimes you have to change tactics, or we change our communication, especially if we're confronted with, oh, well, I don't like that, I think it's going to cost more. And usually we go to the other side of it as well. You know, we want continuous operations, right? Yeah, well, in case of storms, you want continuous operations. We don't start talking about resilience for a lot of people or anything until, if they're really a numbers person, we get the return on investment in front of them first. We get the credits in front of them first. So they start agreeing from the financial side, and then lo and behold, each of those parties, whoever they may be, stakeholders, I've spoken the language, or my team has, of them on that personal interest for them that all contribute to a resilient, sustainable building. And then lo and behold, oh, and by the way, this building has an ROI of this, and here's what it is, and by the way, you guys have continuous operation. You have all of these systems, like, wow, that's great. So we've had to learn that over the years, because we ran into the same thing, JC, on many occasions, that, oh, that's not going to fly here, that's going to cost too much. Okay, well, we have to prove that it's not going to cost too much, or we prove that, by the way, it's really essential to you. So I guess we've run into that a lot. We've gotten really good at speaking the language of whoever we're speaking with, understanding what their essential interest is, but also then finding the common goal. But if the goal is to have those elements, well, you don't want, if you're doing a development project and you have commercial space, well, don't you want those commercial spaces to have continuity of operation? That'll put you better in the marketplace. Your business, those businesses will not fail. If you're in the storm belt, boy, that's great. That means my business is open one day after, and My competitors don't. Well, that's great. That's great for me. That's great for the families who work for me, all of those things. Very few people will deny that. In Houston, after Hurricane Harvey, we worked with the city of Houston. We were asked to come down and run workshops. When we asked to get the list of stakeholders, we noted that there was no big oil companies in the stakeholders. We're like, wait, whoa. The largest employer in Houston are the oil companies. You have to have them at the table. Well, they're the ones causing the problem with some of these storms. No, bring them in. Everyone shares the same value. Everybody wants their families to be safe. Everyone wants their children to go to school. Everyone wants them to go to work and make a living. So in the end, we had the oil industry come in, and they became the biggest supporters of AIA Houston's projects and competitions and things, because ultimately they want a city that is risk adverse and safe for their communities. You find common ground. Of what you do and how you get there needs to be forged together through systems thinking. So that's just one example of what I'm getting at, is how do you identify the stakeholders and find common ground? Because your goals are essentially the same. There's very few people I've run into that don't have the same goal of a healthy, sustainable, resilient future. Just have different ideas to get there. So speak that language. And you're all very good at it. You've argued with clients enough and contractors, you know how to do that work.
Yeah. I had one other thought. Do you have something? Yeah. You asked about LEED. I think I'd have a different answer if the question was passive house. Because as Ken will tell you, you can pursue and sell passive house for very selfish reasons. I mean, your energy costs are going to be a fraction of what they'd otherwise be, and everyone wants that. You are going to have the resilience that Illya talked about with a storm. There's no question. There is going to be fires. There's going to be unhealthy air outside, and don't you want your family to have nice, clean air to breathe and be healthier? And the fact is, it only costs like 2% more, and that's more than made up by the savings in your operating costs. So that, I think I could encourage people, and I think you could be hopeful about persuading folks to design and build according to the passive house principles. So a little plug for Ken's group.
So I want to do a little academic theorizing to what we've been talking about. So it would seem to me the issue begins with, creativity is a dissatisfaction. It's a dissatisfaction with the way things are. I mentioned this in my lecture, and that there was a disagreement in our group about how you deal with the dissatisfaction. So we've heard a couple of different ways. A dissatisfaction, you become the developer. A dissatisfaction, you build trust with the community. A dissatisfaction, you organize stakeholders. You get the funding. But it begins with a dissatisfaction. And for me, as a person of color who's involved in social equity, racial equity, I think it's to become critically aware of the implications of our dissatisfactions, and from a number of different perspectives. And that's that first step of the Paulo Freire consciousness raising of, when you're looking at something, saying, who does this affect? And how can I get all of the different perspectives on this into my analysis of what's wrong? And from there, you become the developer or the builder of trust and whatever.
That coincides much of how I feel about these things as well. I see myself as a world citizen, not just I'm a world architect, citizen, architect of the world, because the world is sort of my home and my community. And so when parts of the world are in pain, we should feel that pain, I think, not just when our own neighborhood is in pain. So does anyone have a pressing question? Or
One more, sorry. First, JC, thank you for organizing this.
Katie.
very challenging ideas.
Who knows some speakers? JC knows people, wonderful people. Thank you, JC.
My question might be directed
And
to
Jay.
Illya. As we're recognizing, most of us are local practicing architects, right? So we're very involved in our communities and hopefully to great degrees. I've always felt this sort of need, would love to have some kind of model document or principles that I could engage my community on to address these ideas. So I'm wondering that the national AIA,
Yep.
which also could be Westchester AIA, could put together a document that would summarize these very important principles that then we as local practitioners could approach our communities about and say, here's our challenge, here are ways that we could start approaching that. I acknowledge Christina's done a wonderful job in her village with making great progress on that count. And I just know that we need to try to find a way to utilize the fact that we're all this dispersed crowd and utilize the connectivity of that dispersion to help achieve these things.
Yeah, so the question was, are there any resources, what resources would be available to galvanize the architecture community, not just here, but any place, and are there resources that AIA has produced or others to go to collective action as an architecture community and advance a resilient, sustainable future? I paraphrased. But yes, there's a couple of great documents from AIA produced. And so this is the thing, communication for any entity is a challenge to its members or whatever resources. A good example is I use the FEMA library all the time. It has every detail, drawn by architects, by the way, of how to do detailed, resilient construction and impact resistant all the way to the Department of Defense level. It's all drawn for you, right? So, but they don't communicate it, they don't train, there's just a giant library, right? So because I'm clued in, my office just regularly uses that for part of our design efforts. Same goes with the AIA. Has anybody in here heard of the Resilience Design Toolkit? It was released earlier this year. Yes, I've got some hands up. Yes, 4, maybe 5. So this is a Resilience Design Toolkit, free download for the AIA. It tells you how to build resilience into your office and its practice. And it has the ability for you to do exactly what you said. Collectively use that as a tool to not only advocate in your communities, but also to start moving everything in the right direction for those pieces. So that's one of the great pieces that AIA has that we just don't use all that much. So that's kind of the short answer of yes, there is a lot of materials out there. Do we get it out to and do training of and work with components as we should? Not really, right? So that's the first piece of advice that I would give you. There are a couple other documents that AI produces, but here in AI New York State, we just released the Resilience Design Guideline for the state, or it's just being released. If Valerie's here, someone, okay, so it's any minute now. And after the pandemic, we convened, Tim Boylan, myself, many others across the state, and this is with a lot of non-AI members, a lot of engineers, people at emergency management for the state, all over the place. We put this guide together to be released for each component to have all the materials they need when disaster strikes, preparing for how do you get your members and all the things that are necessary, not just for emergencies, but how to really advance this. And then outside the AIA, every community has a hazard mitigation plan, or at your county level. The HMP is rewritten every 4 years. I've done the one for New York City in 2019 and now in the 2024 release. So as an architect or an AIA, you should be volunteering to get on that. What the hazard mitigation plan is your community's response to disasters in every sector. But over those next 4 or 5 years, when it's in play, all federal funding that comes to your county for adaptation and mitigation are filtered through there. That's where the source of all of the government work is. It has to align with the HMP. So there's the playbook of here's what's going to be spent in my county for the next 5 years, in my towns. We helped write it as AI members. And now when the federal funding comes, we know what that looks like. We know where to find the money, apply for it, partner with schools or the construction authority or whatever it is, because we know that funding is coming. So that's an important document. And I'm serious, volunteer. They would love to have architects on it. New York City they're so happy that a bunch of us have jumped on to help write that every year. I've been writing the one in U.S. Virgin Islands now, 2 cycles as well. There's one in Puerto Rico that I did the comments on. So you can kind of see where work is coming for architects and how we are influencing what should be better for communities through those listening sessions. Globally at the UN? So that is a different engagement. But also, through the AIA, we've been able to get involved, and now we're on many of these working groups that identify what that sustainable, resilient future looks like through the building sector. We're just making inroads because we're kind of, the last 4 years, we've been really advancing that, and that's going to pay a lot of dividends. Now, remember, AIA, American Institute of Architects, we're in 100 countries. We have 98,000 members in 100 countries. So yes, the majority are here in the US, but we have thousands of members, a lot of just expats who are working all over the world and have started components and chapters they're supported. So that has helped us have a global imprint on how we advance these issues about net zero and how the funding comes forward. The element that I mentioned about the hospitals and retrofit of hospitals, that was because we were actually just there in the room. So much of that is going on. And today's World Habitat Day, by the way. So the millions of units for housing that needs to be built across the world. So 3 years ago, we got engaged with UN Habitat Forum as the AIA in a very serious way. How do we, as the architecture profession, help solve the issues of housing across the world? So we have a lot of members engaged in it, but has it turned into the landslide of work and the matchmaking that is necessary? Not yet, but at least we're moving that direction, you know? More to come.
I think we're going to wrap it up, right? But I wanted to end, have Katie Alberte, who did do the majority of the work for this event, along with our committee and Adina as well, and others, Jan, thank everyone who did contribute to this event. I want to thank the AIA chapter for Westchester and Hudson Valley. And I want to thank our sponsors today, who also made it possible, the financial component. But also, especially, I want to speak these 3 speakers who, in some ways, overlapped wonderfully. Bruce talked about specific case studies that moved the needle, per se, moved the envelope. Sharon talked about behavioral issues that are very important to the context of our problem and our global situation. And then I'd argue Illya wonderfully synthesized those 2 areas of study. So again, I'd like to thank all 3 of you for your participation today. It's not easy to be on Millbrook on a Monday morning at 9, but you know, we really appreciate your contribution to today's effort, as well as the morning speakers as well. Thank you all so much. Katie, you can wrap it up.
I'm going to wrap it up first. For your consideration, there's a QR code that you can scan to make sure you get credit for, not just scan, but then fill out the survey. We'd like to know what you think and your ideas about how to improve as we do these. This is our 2nd conference, and it's been really terrific. And again, if you can't deal with that, Valerie will email you a code. I also want to give wonderful thanks to the staff of the Cary Institute, especially Heather Malcolm, Christine, I can't remember her last name, Michael, who's been running our AV, and it's just totally wonderful, and everyone else from the Cary Institute who's been so supportive of us here. And I also want to thank Adina and the members of the committee whose their enthusiasm and their vision has made this such a wonderful day. Jan, as I said, pulled out his Rolodex and came up with wonderful ideas, as did JC and Adina and Christina, who said, I will speak, and maybe we can get Ken. And it all came together. It's really great. Thank you so much for coming out and for being part of the conversation. Oh, and again, thanking our sponsors, Rings End, 475 High Performance Building Supply, and Westlake Royal Building Products. I hope all of you have had a chance to talk to them.